Picture a sterile white laboratory. You know, you've got the beakers, the microscopes, perfectly controlled variables.
Right, the classic scientist in a pristine coat.
Exactly. Carefully isolating a single chemical reaction. No, take all of that and just throw it completely out the window.
Because that is definitely not what we are talking about today.
No, not at all. Because when your scientific subject is human beings, your laboratory might be like a dense rainforest, or a bustling city street, or even an unfamiliar hospital ward.
It is incredibly messy.
It's messy, it's entirely unpredictable, and honestly, sometimes it's downright dangerous. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to demystify how we actually know what we know about human cultures and societies.
Yeah, you read headlines every day about sociology, human behavior, psychology, but we rarely talk about where that data actually comes from.
Right. So today we are pulling back the curtain on field work and field research. And to do this, we're looking at a stack of incredibly detailed sources.
We got some heavy hitters today.
We do. We have encyclopedic academic texts on field research by anthropologist J.P. Linstroth, and another text just simply titled Fieldwork by David M. Fetterman.
And we also have some biographical notes on Linstroth's own highly diverse research background to kind of anchor this in real-world practice.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the leap from studying chemicals in a beaker to studying humans in the wild is, well, it's a massive jump in complexity.
It is the ultimate uncontrolled environment. I mean, when you're studying human life, you literally cannot isolate variables the way a chemist or a physicist can.
You just have to step out into the sheer chaos of everyday existence.
Right, and somehow find a method to systematically and objectively record it. But to really grasp how researchers pull this off today, we kind of have to look backward first.
Yeah, to understand the radical historical shift that created this discipline in the first place, because scientists weren't always wading into that chaos.
No, they definitely were not.
Right, like in the Victorian era, the leading minds in this field were what the texts call armchair ethnological theorists.
I love that term. Armchair theorists.
It's so descriptive. People like Sir James Fraser, these were scholars who, they never actually visited the cultures they were writing about.
Not once.
They would just sit in their comfortable studies in London or Oxford and write these sweeping treatises on human belief systems.
Yeah. Fraser and a lot of his contemporaries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they relied entirely on comparative accounts.
What does that mean, exactly?
Well, they would read reports mailed back by missionaries, merchants, or, colonial administrators.
Ah, okay.
And from those secondary sources, they attempted to piece together these grand universal theories about human civilization.
Which is wild because they were analyzing humanity without any true firsthand knowledge of the specific human beings they were analyzing.
Exactly. They were essentially trusting the interpretations of people who were often only there to conquer, convert, or trade.
Which, I mean, that seems completely counterintuitive to the scientific method. To use an analogy, it's like writing a comprehensive, authoritative review for a restaurant based entirely on reading its menu.
Right, or maybe talking to the delivery driver.
Yes, without ever once stepping foot inside or tasting the food. And worse, the delivery driver in this scenario has a vested interest in describing the food a certain way.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
But then, the sources describe a massive paradigm shift. The discipline moves from the armchair to the island.
Specifically, the Trobriand Islands.
Right, and this shift is widely credited to Bronislaw Malinowski. He's considered a founding father of modern anthropological fieldwork.
Because between 1915 and 1918, Malinowski did something that was considered pretty revolutionary for the academic establishment.
He actually went to live with the Trobriand Islanders in Melanesia.
He didn't just observe them from a distance. The text described this as the moment anthropologists got off the terrace.
Off the terrace, yeah.
Because before this, a colonial administrator might literally sit on the veranda of a colonial estate, looking down at the local population, taking notes from an observable, physically and socially safe distance.
But Malinowski introduced the concept of participant observation.
To go back to that restaurant analogy, he didn't just read the menu. He went into the kitchen, put on an apron, and worked the line for 3 years.
I love that. Yeah, the goal was to acquire the subjective point of view of the native.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how monumental that intellectual rupture was for the social sciences. Malinowski redefined the discipline from one of armchair conjecturing to one of embedded practice.
It became about actually being with the community.
Exactly. Being with the other for a prolonged period, participating in their everyday routines, learning their language, and really trying to understand their logic from the inside out.
It was a deliberate attempt to close the vast gap between the observer and the subject. But I have to push back on this early era of fieldwork.
Okay, lay it on me.
Even if they got off the terrace and started living in the villages, didn't this practice of just observing the natives still carry a massive amount of colonial baggage?
Oh, absolutely.
Because these were still largely European men, funded by colonial empires, dropping into far-off places in Africa, Asia, or South America.
Right.
The power dynamics there are incredibly unequal, and surely that colors the data they collect.
You're completely right. The history of field research grew directly out of colonial administration, and the texts show how the discipline eventually had to reckon with that exact criticism.
When did that reckoning happen?
Really, by the 1980s, you start seeing these postmodern inquiries shaking the foundations of the field. Thinkers like James Clifford and George Marcus began dismantling the authoritative assumptions of traditional fieldwork.
Because the traditional ethnographer essentially wrote with the voice of God.
Yes, the voice of God.
Yeah. They would write, this is how these people are, as if it were an absolute objective fact, completely ignoring the reality that their own background, their gender, and their colonial funding were coloring every single observation they made.
And alongside those postmodern critiques, feminist theories actively challenged these assumptions as well. They questioned who holds the power in writing about culture.
Right, and how the traditional subject-object dichotomy distorts the truth.
It forced the discipline to realize that the observer is never completely invisible, and they are never entirely neutral. The researcher brings their own worldview into the field, and that worldview interacts with the subjects.
But recognizing that your presence alters the community doesn't solve the physical problem of being there.
No, it definitely doesn't.
If you're no longer an invisible voice of God taking notes on a terrace, how do you actually navigate the messy reality of living in these spaces today? When researchers get out of the universities, how do they handle the logistics of the unpredictable?
Well, according to the sources, there isn't just one monolithic way to do it. The texts outline 5 main qualitative traditions that researchers follow.
Depending on what they're trying to understand, right?
Exactly. So there is biography, which is studying a single individual's life. There is phenomenology, which focuses on understanding a specific experience.
Okay.
Grounded theory involves building a theory entirely from the ground up based on newly collected data. Ethnography is the immersive study of an entire culture. And case study focuses on an in-depth analysis of a single event or entity.
But regardless of which tradition you use, the first and arguably hardest hurdle is just getting access.
Oh, absolutely. The red tape is real.
Imagine you want to study a specific group. You have to navigate visas, foreign governments that might actively restrict access to indigenous populations, and massive language barriers.
And then once you physically get there, you have to build trust.
Yes. I found the example of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the text really striking.
Her work is a prime example of the phenomenological tradition.
Studying a specific profound phenomenon experienced by a group of people.
Right. In her case, she wanted to study the absolute raw first-person experience of terminally ill patients facing death.
Which is incredibly heavy. You obviously can't just walk into a hospital ward with a clipboard and start asking vulnerable people about dying.
No, the ethical and emotional barriers are massive.
She needed strict permission to access these individuals, and she had to build an immense amount of trust to interview them about something so deeply personal.
And even when you get that access, in any field study, people don't immediately act naturally around a researcher with a notepad.
No, of course not.
David M. Fetterman outlines this phenomenon in his text, calling it company manners.
Company manners. I love that term.
It's so accurate. When you first arrive in a community, whether it's a hospital ward or a remote village, people are polite. They filter their behavior.
They present an artificial, idealized version of themselves to the outsider.
Exactly. But the longer a researcher stays, those company manners eventually fade. The typical normative behavior reemerges and becomes dominant because people simply cannot maintain a facade 24 hours a day for months on end.
But getting to that normative behavior means adapting to whatever life throws at you. You can't control the environment.
Not at all.
The text mentions a colleague who was doing field research in China in 1989 and unexpectedly got caught in the Tiananmen Square protests.
Wow. Yeah, you certainly can't plan for a historical revolution in your initial grant proposal.
Definitely not. But it happens on a smaller daily scale, too. The text provides a great biographical example from the author himself, J.P. Linstroth.
His background is incredibly diverse. He has done field work with Basque populations in Spain, Brazilian urban Amerindians, and with Cuban, Haitian, and Guatemalan Mayan immigrants in South Florida.
Right. But during his time in the Basque Country, he arrived with a specific, planned intention to study their fishing culture.
Oh, this is a great story.
When he actually gets there, his informants completely ignore the fishing topic. They only wanted to discuss a local controversy about the inclusion of women in a historical commemoration.
They just didn't care about the fishing questions.
Which makes me wonder, if you spend months, maybe years, getting a highly specific grant proposal approved by a university committee to study fishing, and then you arrive and the locals only want to talk about a local parade controversy, don't you fail your study?
That's a really common fear for new researchers.
Because it's like spending 3 years training for a marathon, showing up to the starting line, and realizing they've swapped the race for a deep-sea dive. You can either drown trying to run underwater, or you learn to swim on the spot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, qualitative research demands exactly the kind of on-the-spot swimming you just described.
So you don't fail.
No, you don't fail the study, you adapt the study. Fieldwork combines rigorous academic preparation with the serendipity of real-life experience.
You just go with the flow.
You follow the new leads as you learn what is actually important to the community, rather than what you assumed was important from your office back home.
But how do you maintain that scientific rigor when you're just rolling with the punches of daily life? How do you make sure you are collecting valid data and not just writing a travel diary?
Researchers rely on a few key methodological tools. One is using unobtrusive measures.
Unobtrusive measures?
Yeah, to avoid the bias of asking direct questions and triggering those company manners we talked about, field workers interpret daily events through things that are already present in the environment.
Like what?
Clothing choices, shifts in dialect, body piercings, tattoos, graffiti on the walls, or even local newspapers.
Oh, wow.
These elements provide unadulterated clues about social status, political attitudes, and power dynamics without ever having to conduct a formal interview.
It's like reading the room without asking anyone how they feel.
The second major tool is triangulation. You never just trust one single source of information.
You compare different forms of data.
Exactly. You take an interview you conducted, cross-reference it with local graffiti you observed, and check it against government documents to rule out rival hypotheses.
Because ultimately, in qualitative research, the researcher themselves is the human instrument.
There is no thermometer to measure culture. The researcher's own observation, judgment, and interpretation are the primary tools.
Which explains why taking field notes is such an obsessive, mandatory part of the job. The text notes that field workers typically write up their notes every single day, while the events, conversations, and sites are still incredibly fresh and vivid.
They have to. And they record not just what the community is doing, but they actively monitor their own behavior, their own reactions, and their own perceptions.
To minimize their impact on the scene.
They have to track their own biases continuously. Because as a human instrument interacting with other humans, the potential to cause harm is really significant.
And that reality brings us to a critical transition in the texts, the ethical minefield. Because the history of this discipline isn't just a story of abstract theoretical debates.
No, it's really not.
It includes some very dark chapters where real people were profoundly harmed. And because researchers are human instruments interacting with vulnerable communities, those past events have fundamentally transformed how modern fieldwork is conducted.
The historical ethical failures detailed in the sources are sobering. They are the direct reason why institutional review boards, or IRBs, exist today at universities.
To approve, monitor, and regulate research involving human subjects.
Exactly.
The sources list several of these historical reckonings. There was the U.S. Tuskegee Syphilis Project, a study spanning decades where treatment for syphilis, specifically penicillin, was intentionally withheld from African-American study participants.
Even long after the cure became widely available.
Yes. The researchers wanted to study the unabated progression of the disease, causing horrific, unnecessary harm and death to the participants and their families.
It's awful. The text also detailed Project Camelot in the 1960s, which was a U.S. Department of Defense program.
What happened there?
The military funded social scientists to evaluate the causes of societal breakdown and warfare. But the underlying reality was that this research was intended to be used to predict and undermine left-wing revolutionary movements in Latin America.
Oh, wow. So their data was being weaponized.
Exactly. When the academic community realized that their neutral sociological observations were being used by the military like that, it caused an absolute uproar about the ethical use of data.
Then you have psychologist Stanley Milgram's famous studies on authority and obedience at Yale.
Right, the electric shock ones.
Yeah. Participants were systematically deceived into thinking they were administering increasingly dangerous electric shocks to another person in the next room.
While no actual shocks were given, the severe psychological toll and trauma inflicted on the participants who believed they were harming someone raised massive ethical concerns about deception and research.
And the text also points to the fierce controversy involving anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon and geneticist James Neel.
Regarding their research and medical practices among the Yanomami peoples of Brazil and Venezuela.
So all of these events forced a total ethical overhaul within the social sciences.
They had to. Ethics review boards were created to guarantee informed consent, to prevent unwarranted deception, and to ensure the privacy, confidentiality, and overall physical and mental well-being of the human subjects being studied.
The fundamental non-negotiable rule became respect for all persons. But the sources show that modern fieldwork goes far beyond just a baseline of do no harm now, because the context of the world has changed dramatically.
That's very true.
The texts point out that the whole idea of globalization as some brand new modern phenomenon is actually a complete misnomer.
Right. The West has been globalizing people since colonial contact began in the 16th century.
It's not a new thing.
No. The idea that there are isolated, pristine, completely static cultures out there waiting to be discovered is just a myth. Human populations have been in contact with one another, trading and sharing ideas for millennia.
Culture is never static. It is always shifting and changing over time.
The only real difference now is the velocity.
The speed of it all. Technological advances, immediate global communication, resource extraction. These globalizing processes are hitting marginalized communities faster and harder than ever before.
And because of that intense existential pressure, the role of the anthropologist has shifted in many cases from being a detached observer to being an active advocate.
This is a crucial transformation in the text.
The sources highlight how whole worldviews, languages, and peoples are disappearing at alarming rates due to these pressures.
So in some instances, the field is no longer just a place to passively study.
Right. It is an imagined future where vulnerable people must be actively protected by the researchers, scientists, and non-governmental organizations who work with them.
We see this vividly in the specific examples provided in the sources. Take the Kayapo people in Brazil.
Okay.
They have been fighting miners and ranchers encroaching on their traditional lands since the 1970s. They've also been fighting massive government development projects for hydroelectric dams that would flood their territories.
And anthropologists like Terence Turner and David Maybury Lewis, who co-founded the organization Cultural Survival, they didn't just take notes.
No, they became equally important in advocating for and assisting in Kayapo resistance.
The same dynamic is true for the Kungsan people in Namibia and Botswana. The texts detail how they have suffered tremendously.
They were dispossessed from their traditional homelands, right?
Yeah, forced into government settlements, dealt with rampant alcoholism, and were completely uprooted from their traditional nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
But they fought back in the legal system. In 2006, the Kungsan successfully argued a landmark court case for a return to their ancestral land in Botswana's Central Kalahari Game Reserve.
And anthropologists provided crucial data and advocacy as part of that fight for self-determination.
The text also mentions researcher Daryl Posey, who worked tirelessly for indigenous intellectual property rights.
Oh, it's a huge issue.
He fought to protect traditional indigenous knowledge about the medicinal properties of local plants from being exploited and patented by massive pharmaceutical companies without any benefit returning to the indigenous communities.
So what does this all mean?
Honestly, I really have to push back here because this sounds like a fundamental departure from the scientific method.
How so?
Well, if researchers are actively co-founding advocacy groups, fighting alongside subjects in courtrooms, and battling pharmaceutical companies over patents, haven't they just stopped being scientists?
I see what you're saying.
That crosses the line from objective observation into pure political activism. How can we trust the data if the researcher is taking a side in a legal battle?
This raises an important question, and it's a tension the discipline wrestles with constantly. But the modern paradigm shift in the social sciences rests on the realization we discussed earlier. The purely objective researcher, the invisible fly on the wall who leaves no footprint, is largely a myth.
You cannot exist in a community without impacting it.
Exactly. Because the very act of studying them requires resources, attention, and translation that inherently alters their environment.
That makes sense.
The modern view established in the texts is that if fieldwork is to continue at all, it must be based on genuine coexistence and respect.
Protecting the actual lives, worldviews, and rights of the people being studied is now considered more ethically vital than simply extracting data from them for an academic journal.
The legacy of fieldwork today is increasingly defined by how researchers collaborate with and protect those they study. It's a recognition that you cannot ethically study a disappearing culture while doing absolutely nothing to prevent its disappearance.
That is a profound shift. We've traced an incredible journey today.
We really have.
We started with Victorian armchair theorists making grand assumptions from thousands of miles away. We moved to colonial administrators watching from the terrace, and then to the messy, unpredictable realities of embedded fieldwork, where researchers navigate language barriers and parade controversies.
The discipline navigated horrific historical, ethical disasters to finally arrive at this modern era where researchers actively advocate for the survival of the very cultures they study.
It is an ongoing evolution from extraction to collaboration. Qualitative research today attempts to combine the rigorous, systematic observation of daily life with a deep, ethical responsibility to the human beings who are sharing that life with the researcher.
Exactly.
And for you listening, why does this deep dive matter for your daily life? It matters because every time you read a headline about a new psychological study, a sociological trend, or an article about cultural history, you are looking at the end product of this exact rigorous process.
You are reading the polished result of field work.
Remembering the messy human-to-human interaction behind that data, the need to overcome company manners, the adaptation to unexpected events, the ethical tightropes walked by the human instruments collecting the data, makes you a sharper, more critical consumer of information.
It reminds you that science, when it involves humans, is never perfectly sterile.
It is always a fundamentally human endeavor, mediated by human instruments.
And perhaps the most lingering thought from the texts is the acknowledgement that the presence of an engaged researcher will always have some effect on the people in the community.
Which leaves us with a fascinating paradox to consider.
Right. If the very act of observing a culture inherently changes how that culture behaves, is it ever truly possible to know what humanity looks like when nobody is watching?